Welcome back. We are joined today by Professor John Mearsheimer to get a better understanding of what is happening in the world now with this new great power rivalry, and also how the outcome of the Ukraine war will impact this new Cold War. Thank you for coming on. and I thought I wanted to open up with a very big question, which is, have we entered a new Cold War? And if so, who are the players? What are the competing interests? And what are the rules of this new Cold War?
Well, I think we have entered a new Cold War. I think we're in a multipolar system, and I think the United States, China, and Russia are the three great powers. And the United States is certainly in a Cold War with China. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? I think as a result of the fact that China is so powerful and threatens to dominate East Asia, and that the United States will almost certainly go to great lengths to prevent that from happening, you axiomatically have an intense security competition in China. And I, excuse me, think you've seen evidence of this over the past few years. And for me, an intense security competition is a Cold War. And I distinguish a Cold War from a hot war. A hot war is when two countries like the United States and China actually get into a fight with each other. And of course, that's what we want to avoid. But the fact is, we are in a Cold War with the Chinese, or the Chinese are in a Cold War with us. It's an intense security competition. And the name of the game is to make sure that security competition or that Cold War does not turn into a hot war. Now, this raises the question, what about Russia? Well, it's quite clear that since we moved into multipolarity, the Russians and the Chinese have been close allies against the United States. And this is largely a result of the Ukraine war, which has pushed the Russians and into the arms of the Chinese and caused the Chinese and the Russians to have very close relations. So the United States, certainly through the Biden administration, was involved in a Cold War with the Russians as well as the Chinese. Now, what's happened with President Trump is he tried to change that situation. He doesn't want to have an intense security competition with Russia. And in fact, if anything, what the Trump administration would like to do is have good relations with Russia and make it a Russia plus US alliance arrayed against China. I think that's the basic goal of President Trump, but he's been unable to make that happen. And the end result is that the United States is basically still in a Cold War with Russia as well as with China. And in both cases, we want to make sure, as I said before, that that Cold War or those Cold Wars don't turn into a hot war. And if anything, if you look at what's happened with regard to Ukraine in recent years, if there is one place where it's likely that a Cold War could turn into a hot war, it's in Ukraine. Ukraine, so far, or Europe so far, or the US Russian relationship so far, has actually been more dangerous than the US China competition. We've had no major crisis in East Asia involving the United States and China. So that Cold War has remained very cold, which is all for the good. But the war in Ukraine, and given some of the events that have taken place there, have made me worry greatly that the Cold War there would turn into a hot war.
Well, I guess the hope and expectation of many European leaders was that the US and Europeans would unite in this new Cold War. So the liberal hegemony is over. So they thought now we would retreat into this, well, essentially go back in time, and we would return to this complete unity as we had in the first Cold War. That is unity in opposition to Russia as a common enemy. And well, this was the assumption of NATO as well, that Ukraine would unite us, but instead now it seems to divide. Uh, what is it that how do you explain this, and what is it that the Europeans don't understand? Is this the US not seeing Russia as a same threat as the Europeans? Is it the concern of pushing Russia towards China? Is Europe too costly of a partner as opposed to being a force amplifier? Or is this just a uniquely Trump policy or approach to international security?
Well, just to take the United States, from an American point of view, it makes eminently good sense to have good relations with Russia. China is the peer competitor. If you sort of array these three great powers from top to bottom in terms of which one is the most powerful, there's no question that the United States remains the most powerful state on the planet. But the Chinese are a close second, and many argue that they're closing the gap. So we have the situation from an American perspective where there is a peer competitor in the system. And that peer competitor has the potential, and I underline the word potential, to dominate East Asia, which the United States does not want to have happen. So we have a vested interest in focusing on East Asia over Europe because Russia is the weakest of the three great powers, and Russia is not a threat to dominate Europe. And to the extent that Russia is a threat in Europe, and again, I don't believe it's a very great threat at all, but to the extent it is a threat, we believe, and this is certainly true of President Trump, that the Europeans can deal with that threat, which should free us to pivot to Asia more fully to deal with this peer competitor called China. So we have a powerful structural incentive. And when I say structural incentive, I'm talking about what the balance of power tells us we should do. We have powerful structural incentive to pivot to East Asia and let the Europeans deal with Russia. So that's our incentive structure, and that's not Europe's incentive structure. Europe is in a very different situation. Europe, because the Russians are right next door, has to think first and foremost about Russia. Now, my view is that Russia was not a threat to Europe. But the Europeans and, of course, the Americans foolishly pushed forward NATO expansion into Ukraine, which has led to this disastrous war. And for a variety of reasons that you know well, Glenn, the Europeans got into a situation where they ended up seeing Russia as a mortal threat. And they are therefore deeply committed to using Ukraine as a battering ram to weaken Russia because they see this Russian threat at every turn. And whether you and I think it's foolish or not is largely irrelevant because they do think that way. So the Europeans have a very different view of the so-called Russian threat than the Americans do. And as I said, if anything, the Americans have an incentive to ally with the Russians against the Chinese. This is anathema to Europeans. They don't want to hear that. And where you see this dispute between the United States and Europe, this transatlantic dispute playing itself out is over Ukraine. Because what's happening with regard to Ukraine is that the Americans are trying to shift the burden of dealing with Ukraine and dealing with the Ukraine war onto the shoulders of the Europeans. The Europeans, on the other hand, are scrambling like crazy to keep the Americans involved in the fight and keep the transatlantic relationship alive and well. But it's very hard to do that when you're dealing with Donald Trump.
But is it still though an incentive of the Europeans? Because if you go back to the 90s, I can see the argument for having for redividing the continent and essentially recreating the logic of the Cold War. Because you would, yes, you would make an enemy out of Russia, but you bring in the United States in Europe as the main pacifier, and um, and well, you essentially maintain the same structure we had throughout the Cold War. So the political West also keeps Europe united. However, now that the United States has signaled clearly that it wants to leave, Won't this continued division of Europe only create more problems? Also, because we can't manage Russia on our own. We're betting everything on the U.S., and the U.S. doesn't even want to be there. We're creating excessive dependencies. Wouldn't it make sense for the Europeans to shift the position on Russia, or what is the threat of Russia? I know that it has big capabilities, but this assumption that they are an empire, that they want to rebuild the Soviet Union, this narrative appears to have emerged after 2014, but it didn't appear in a vacuum. This happened in February of 2022. This is when I guess they began lashing back. Sorry,
Well,
lashing out, I think is the term.
yeah. I I mean, as you and I have said on numerous occasions, there's no question that bringing Ukraine into NATO was destined to lead to big trouble. And of course, in February 2014, a major crisis broke out. And then 8 years later, in February 2022, a war broke out. And that war is still going on. In fact, that war between Russia and Ukraine has lasted longer than the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union during World War II. That's really quite remarkable. And the end result is that it's poisoned relations between Russia on one side and Europe on the other side. And there's no evidence that relations between those two rival sides are going to improve anytime soon. So it looks like you're going to have poisonous relations between Russia and Europe for a long time to come. This is disastrous for the Europeans, in large part because Russia is just not a serious threat. And I believe if you look at Putin's behavior over time, Putin wanted to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Europeans. He's not an aggressor. He's not bent on creating a greater Russia, despite the fact that many people in the West make that argument. He wanted to live a rather peaceful existence with the Europeans. But that's all gone down the toilet bowl now. That's over with. So you have this terrible situation where the Russians and the Europeans are bitter enemies. That's point number one. But point number two, and this is what we were talking about a few minutes ago, at the same time this poisonous relationship has developed, the Americans are talking about greatly reducing, if not leaving Europe. President Trump, as we well know, would like to take a sledgehammer to NATO if he could. He'd wreck that institution if he could. And this is another way of saying that the Americans are threatening to leave Europe, which means the American pacifier, which has played such an important role in keeping the peace in Europe, will disappear. And the Europeans, of course, understand almost to a person that this would not be good, that you want to keep the Americans in Europe because the Americans serve as a pacifying force. They keep all those centrifugal forces that are just below the surface in Europe below the surface. And if the Americans leave, those centrifugal forces will come above the surface. And you will have huge collective action problems trying to work out arrangements among the European countries to deal with this Russian threat that they have done so much to create. So you're getting the worst of both worlds here. And the Europeans seem incapable of recognizing this and doing anything to fix the situation. They're just so deeply committed to this hostile relationship with Russia, and they're having so much trouble dealing with President Trump that it appears that there's no way out for them, and the future, therefore, looks bleak for Europe.
So how will this war end then? I mean, are you optimistic about these negotiations taking place? Because I guess on one hand, we do see that the situation is going from bad to worse on the NATO and Ukraine side, which would, if there's well, if we're being rational, we would seek to cement a good deal today, if well, better than what we would get tomorrow. On the other hand, we saw before Christmas that this 20-point plan of the Americans, which they were trying to sell to the Ukrainians and the Russians, which was already a bit far apart, but the Europeans came in essentially trying to pull it further away towards the Ukrainian side, which would make it even more untenable for the victorious side, which is the Russian. But a lot of things are happening now. Do you have any optimism about these negotiations?
I have zero optimism. I think there is no reason at all to think that these negotiations are going to produce a real peace. If you look at Russia's demands, which have been clearly laid out many, many times, and you recognize that these are basically non-negotiable demands, at least a handful of them are, and we know them well. They're non-negotiable. And then you look at what the European/Ukrainian position is on these demands. They are polar opposites. There's no overlap. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are completely at odds in terms of their demands with Russia's demands. So I don't see how you can even come close to having some sort of agreement. I don't think maybe you can point to any of Russia's major demands where the Europeans have caved in. Uh, the Europeans and the Ukrainians both still want Ukraine to have a security guarantee. And from a Russian point of view, this is unacceptable because it is just another way of putting Ukraine inside of NATO. It's de facto NATO membership. The Russians do not want the United States giving Ukraine an Article 5 security guarantee. But that's what the Ukrainians want, and that's what the Europeans want. With regard to territory, the Russians have made it manifestly clear, again on countless occasions, that they want all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that they have annexed. As best I can tell, the Ukrainians and the Europeans won't even agree to give the Russians full control over those 2 oblasts in the Donbass, much less all 4 oblasts. On territory, there's just no sign of meaningful agreement. And with regard to the size of the Ukrainian army that would exist in any peace agreement, the two sides are light years apart. Uh, the, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are talking about a Ukrainian military that has somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 men in it. At the Istanbul negotiations back in 2022, the Russians were insisting on a Ukrainian army that had about 85,000 soldiers. So when you contrast 85,000 with 600,000 to 800,000 soldiers, you see the two sides are light years apart. Has there been any movement, any sign of a compromise on this issue? No. Has there been any sign of a compromise on the territorial issue? No. Has there been any sign of a compromise on the issue of a security guarantee? No. So what is all this talk about getting some sort of meaningful agreement? This is all, as I like to say, a giant kabuki dance. There's just no there. And nevertheless, just to take this a step further, the Ukrainians and the Europeans continue to talk about a ceasefire. And even occasionally, the Americans talk about a ceasefire. The Russians have again made it unequivocally clear there will be no ceasefire. And in fact, when Trump met with Putin in Anchorage last summer, Trump came out of the meeting saying the whole subject of a ceasefire was off the table because Putin had made it clear to him there was going to be no ceasefire. that this war was going to be settled one way or another on the battlefield. And Trump said that. He recognized it at the time. But with the passage of time, he's back to occasionally talking about ceasefires. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians much more frequently talk about ceasefire. But it's not going to happen. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield. There's eventually going to be, I think, an armistice because one side or the other will prevail. And that's just another way of saying it'll be settled on the battlefield. But it's not going to be settled in diplomatic negotiations in Abu Dhabi or in Istanbul or in Moscow. This is not going to happen, at least based on everything we've seen up to now.
Yeah, I find it very strange, a lot of the rhetoric around, especially when the Europeans are calling for this compromise, because the compromise they could have gotten was pretty good back in 2022, but they waited 4 years, a long time, and they still expect the parties to somehow meet in the middle and come to an agreement. Even more than this, they want the Russians to make the greatest concessions, it seems. And the kind of concession they want, essentially, the reason why the Russians went into Ukraine to prevent the victory, or sorry, prevent NATO from embedding itself into Ukraine, essentially in a peace agreement, which, after a Russian victory, it appears that the Europeans want what the Russians went to war to prevent, which is, European and NATO troops within Ukraine. And also, it baffles me a bit, though, this very normative language they have, because they make the point, well, Ukraine can't make the greatest concession. It's not fair because Russia's the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. So they won't even talk about security guarantees for Russia, as there's no recognition of the security competition. It's just goodies and baddies, an aggressor and a victim. And so the Russian seems to speak in the language of power. That is, we have won. We get to dictate the terms, while the Europeans are speaking this normative language. But that's not fair because you're the aggressor. It's very strange to watch. It's like they're not speaking the same diplomatic language. But sorry.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, Glenn, I actually have an explanation for that. I'm not saying it's the correct explanation, but it's just how I think about this issue. I think that the vast majority of people in the foreign policy elite in Europe, and this is true even in the United States, because I think Trump is something of an anomaly, they all believe that Ukraine in NATO is not an existential threat to Russia. They believe that what is going on here is that Putin is an imperialist and he's trying to create a greater Russia. Yes, it matters for security, but there's a deeper cause at play here. It's just that imperial gene that all Russian or Soviet leaders have. And Putin is particularly aggressive. And this is nothing to do with NATO expansion. How could anybody possibly believe that a benign alliance like NATO, and again, this is where you see the rhetoric about us being the good guys that you were just talking about. How could a benign alliance like NATO possibly be seen by any Russian leader as a mortal threat? That's our worldview here in the West. There are, of course, people like you and I and a handful of others who don't accept that argument, but we're in the minority. Then on the Russian side, they have made it manifestly clear over the years that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. It is, from their perspective, an existential threat. And once you understand that they see what's going on in Ukraine as a threat to their survival, again, whether we in the West like that argument or not, there is an abundance. Let me change my rhetoric. There is a superabundance of evidence that they see what's going on in Ukraine and especially with the Europeans and the Americans backing the Ukrainians, as a mortal threat, as an existential threat. And that's why they are unwilling to make any meaningful compromises. And in fact, as you well know, Glenn, if anything, the situation from their perspective gives them great incentives to take even more territory than they have already taken, to annex more oblasts, to go to greater lengths to wreck Ukraine, to really turn it into a dysfunctional rump state, to poison relations inside of Europe, to poison relations across the Atlantic between the United States on one side and Europe on the other side. Again, once you understand that the Russians see this not as a case of imperialism, but as a case of an existential threat, it looks very different. But we refuse, we in the West, and this, of course, doesn't include us. I want to be clear on that. But people in the West, people in the foreign policy establishments in European countries and in the United States, for the most part, refuse to accept that Russia's got a legitimate point of view, that the Russians actually see things this way. And that's what I think accounts for the fact that the two sides are so far apart. And furthermore, it explains why people in the West are so baffled that the Russians won't make any concessions. They should make concessions, we think. But that's because the picture we have in our head of how the Russians are thinking is simply wrong.
It is interesting, though, the reluctance to accept that the Russians do see NATO as an existential threat, because, well, there's a good point behind the Russian view, I feel often, that if you try to create a Europe without Russia, it would unavoidably become against Russia, because how can you have a Europe where the largest country doesn't belong? It would be as if you create a security architecture in Americas ruled by China, and the United States would be the only one not being allowed to participate. It would unavoidably be seen as being aimed against the United States. So it's very difficult to understand why there's no understanding for this, though, and especially this assumption of our benign intentions after Afghanistan, Iraq, or Yugoslavia as well, Libya, Syria, Iran, Gaza, the last 12 years in Ukraine. There should be some understanding, though, that perhaps it's not just a group of democracies spreading values. But you mentioned this idea of
Glenn,
dividing.
can I just jump in and say a word or two about that? Because I've thought about that question. Um, First of all, I think that it's important to understand that the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO was made in April 2008. And that was during the unipolar moment. It was at the height of the unipolar moment. And we viewed ourselves as the good guys. We were the benign hegemon. And the Europeans bought onto that rhetoric at the time. And we thought that NATO expansion could not possibly be seen as threatening by the Russians in any meaningful way. Because again, we were the good guys. The United States was a benign hegemon, and the Europeans were tagging along with us and behaving in benign ways as well. Now, you could argue that that was wrong, but that's how we thought about it. Then the crisis breaks out in 2014, and of course, the war breaks out in 2022. But as soon as the crisis breaks out in 2014, and you have really serious trouble, then the question becomes, who is responsible? Right? And this question is sitting out there today. Who is responsible for this disaster? Well, if you believe that it was NATO expansion that's largely responsible for causing this war, this disaster, this unbelievable disaster, then you're saying the West is responsible. If you say that Russia was driven by imperialist ambitions, that Putin is a classic Russian imperialist who had to be stopped, then Putin has to be blamed. So we in the West have a vested interest in making the argument that Putin was an imperialist and it was his imperial ambitions that caused the war, because we want to put the responsibility for this war, we want to blame him for this war. If you go down the road that we have gone down, you and I, and make the argument that NATO expansion is principally responsible for this disaster, you're in effect saying the West is responsible. And for leaders in the West, this is a categorically unacceptable argument.
But where do we go from here on, though? Because there's been a lot of pressure on the Kremlin, well, on Putin to change his tactics a bit. I mean, this is not new. I remember all the way back after 2014 when he tried to patch things up with the Europeans. There were a lot of hawks in the Kremlin who was making the argument that, if they don't act more assertively, the NATO would interpret Russia's efforts to make up with NATO as weakness. So they said, well, why are we negotiating? We should be preparing for war, essentially. But this has gone on, all the way since until now, 2026, when they're saying, why aren't we taking off, this gloves and putting an end to this war? Do you see it? Do you see Russia changing course anytime soon? Because I do see some escalation lately. That is not just the efforts to destroy all of the electric grids to turn off the lights, but also this quasi-blockade on Odessa by attacking ships going in and out, the ports, the bridges. It seems like we might be entering a new stage of the war. Or do you see it differently?
Well, I think the Russians believe that the Ukrainians are on the ropes, and that there is a good chance that uh, over the course of this year, 2026, that Ukraine will collapse, that the Russians will win on the battlefield. And they can do that conventionally, of course. Um, Whether that happens is hard to say. It's quite remarkable how tenacious the Ukrainians have been on the battlefield. I thought that by the end of 2025, the war would have been over. There would have been an armistice. I didn't think that the Ukrainians would still be hanging on. They are hanging on. I think they're hanging on by a thread, but they are hanging on. And they are continuing to get support, especially from the Europeans, but also from the Americans. So it's possible that by the end of 2026, they'll still be in the fight. It is possible. And I think as this coming year plays itself out, what you'll see is the Russians upping the ante at the conventional level. I think they'll commit more forces to the fight. They have large reserve armies that they've not committed, and I think they'll commit them. And I think they'll try to finish off the Ukrainians in 2026. If that doesn't happen, I think there will be powerful reasons for the Russians to up the ante and even think about using nuclear weapons. If you look at Sergei Karaganov, who I take to be a mainstream Russian strategist who's been around for a long time, knows all the arguments about security and international relations theory and deterrence and so forth and so on. You listen to him talk, he's basically saying that the time is ripe for the Russians to use nuclear weapons to put an end to this war. But I think if the West believes that it can uh, keep the Russians engaged in a war of attrition and prevent the Russians from winning that war for a few more years, they're wrong. The Russians will do something to end the war. And that's something I think might very well be the use of nuclear weapons. Again, you want to remember what I said before when I described this war as an existential threat from Russia's point of view. The Russians view what's going on as a mortal threat, number one. And number two, if they get into a position where they think they cannot win this war, and in fact that they are suffering greatly because the war just hasn't come to an end, they will be in desperate straits. And when great powers with nuclear weapons are in desperate straits, uh, you want to really worry about what they might do. Uh, and so I think that in a very important way, everyone should hope that the Russians win this war at the conventional level rather quickly in the first part of 2026. And there's no incentive for the Russians to really go up the escalation ladder.
I guess another reason why they might want to finish off sooner is all the logic here coming out of some European capitals that we have to keep the Ukrainians in the fight a bit more so we can prepare ourselves. I mean, if there's a possibility that the Europeans are preparing themselves and possibly entering the war at a later stage, then it would be much better to finish the war now before it has the time, I guess, to actually expand into a wider, like, pan-European war. But, just
Can I ask
yeah.
can I ask you a question, Glenn? What is your sense of, the pressure that's on Putin, uh, to sort of up the ante, to escalate and to get this war over with? Do you have a sense that he's under tremendous pressure to do that? And if so, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think there's a lot of pressure, for not to take any, like, weak deal coming out of Washington because of all, because they paid a heavy price as well. This has been 4 years of war. They lost tens of thousands of men, and the idea, I think, is that if they agree to any deal which would allow the West to essentially revive the Ukrainian front line in the future, and they would have to fight this whole thing over again, that would be completely unacceptable. So there's many who, I guess, are questioning why he hasn't brought this to an end already with more fierce means. I mean, this is not just Russians. I've spoken to many foreign ambassadors to Russia, and well, no, not the European ones, but others who also have expressed, confusion about why he hasn't taken a much harder approach yet. And no, I don't know. Putin's not whispering in my ear, so I'm not quite sure. But but I do think on some level that they're also preparing that if Ukraine does fall, when it falls, that this would cause a massive desperation in the West, especially in Europe, and this could lead to some um, reckless behavior, possibly joining in on the war. And if this happens, it's better for Russia to be prepared. So, having built up enough weaponry, at least enough Oreshnik missiles, which can strike critical infrastructure in Europe, if this is what the decision the Europeans are going for. So, but again, I'm yeah, I'm not sure where, well, what direction they might be going. I know that a lot of the pressure which came from on Putin before he rejected it. You mentioned Karaganov. You know, he would come to every yearly Valdai meeting. He would ask, more or less Putin, why aren't we changing a nuclear doctrine? And Putin every year said, no, this is not the time for it. We have to keep it. And then, of course, at the end, he listened to Karaganov, and now they changed the nuclear doctrine. And many people think this is political theater, but when I used to work as professor in Moscow, and I actually worked in the department with Karaganov being my boss, because this was the greater Eurasia focus. They focused on Russia's pivot to the east, so looking at how the technology mix, how Russia can cooperate with China. And I spoke to him many times, and he's quite convinced that NATO Article 5, it wouldn't be implemented in the way many people think. If to read the text carefully, and also, I don't think this is theater. I think there's a lot of people within Moscow who really wants this to be escalated in a big way. But I'm not sure how Putin is influenced by it, though.
And if you don't go nuclear, right, what do you think that the Russians can do at the conventional level to win a quick victory this coming spring or summer? In other words, do you buy the argument that they have large reserve armies that they can bring to bear, that they can change their strategy and punch through the front lines? And collapse the Ukrainian defenses? I mean, what do you think the options are that the Russians have at the non-nuclear level to win this war or put an end to this war?
Well, it is a war of attrition. So once the adversary's army is weakened and you have opportunities to punch through the front line, there's other opportunities. Now you can disrupt a lot of the communication, the logistics. It's more possibility to surround large grouping of troops. So I think this is where they're going with it, because now that you see the Ukrainian army being weakened, they have a massive manpower shortage. At this point in time, the Russians seem to be opening new fronts, especially in Kharkov and Sumy. So I assume that as Ukraine seem to be on the yeah, on the what's called the point of breaking, then this will be the time to open up a larger front line. And you also had reports, which have been confirmed in Western media, that a lot of the new military hardware being developed, that is armored vehicle and all, it's not actually going to the front. They're building up in the rear. So again, it's hard to know in the fog of war what's real or not. But my impression is that they're building up a big force in the rear. Whether this is for uh, while taking advantage of a massive breakthrough in Ukraine, or if this is for us, that is, if the Europeans decide to enter the war. For me, this is unclear, though.
Yeah.
Um, yes, just a very brief last question as we run out of time. What is sees to being the likely way if Ukraine is and NATO's being defeated in this war? What is it that would bring Ukraine down? Is it a military defeat? Is it economic, political fragmentation? Or, do you have any views on this?
Well, I think that what will happen here is that at some point Ukraine is going to be defeated on the battlefield. Uh, and given all the problems that the Ukrainians have, and given the fact that the Europeans can only do so much to help them, and the Americans are trying to wean themselves from the Ukraine war, it's hard to see how Ukraine can hang on over the long term. So I think they lose on the battlefield. At the same time, I think their economy is in desperate straits. And if they were to lose Odessa and even more territory than they've already lost, that would just add to their woes. So I think economically, the rub state that results from this war will be a basket case. It'll be an economic basket case. And then on the political side, I would imagine that you're going to have huge political fights inside of Ukraine once the war is over with. There's going to be a big blame game. Who's going to be blamed for losing this war? And it'll be ugly. So I think economically and politically, life in this Ukrainian rump state will be ugly. And then, of course, they will have lost on the battlefield as well. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what do Ukraine-Russia relations look like moving forward? And as I said before, I thought European Russian relations would be poisonous. I think there's no question the relations between Ukraine and Russia will be poisonous. And I think relations between Ukraine and Europe will be very messy, because there'll be some countries in Europe, like Hungary and Slovakia, that have a very different way of thinking about Ukraine than countries like France, Britain, and Germany. And even countries like France and Germany, or France and Britain, will be at loggerheads on some key issues regarding Ukraine. So uh, Ukraine is facing a dismal future. And we haven't even added in the demographic issue. I mean, this is a country that's facing, a demographic death spiral. It's just horrendous what's happening. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning that says it's time for Ukraine to begin to mobilize younger people, people who are in their late teens and early 20s who've been largely exempt from the draft. That would be really good. Take all those young people and feed them into the meat grinder. I mean, this is crazy, right? It'll just exacerbate the demographic situation, which is already disastrous. So once this war is over with, Ukraine is going to be in terrible shape. There's no way that it comes out of this war uh, winning in any way. It loses on almost every dimension. And excuse me, Glenn. And this, of course, is why people like you and I have long argued that this war should have been settled a long time ago. This is why the Ukrainians should not have walked away from the negotiating process at Istanbul in the spring of 2022. Their situation has just gotten continually worse with the passage of time. And if they manage to hang in there for another year or two, their situation is not going to improve. That's what's very important to understand here. Staying in the fight has never been a smart strategy from their point of view. They should have put an end to this a long time ago. So, uh, when you add it all up, it's just categorically depressing. And by the way, this gets back to my earlier point, Glenn, that the question of who is to blame for this disaster is going to come racing to the fore once it's over, once the war is over with, once the fighting stops, once you get some sort of armistice. Then the question is going to become who caused this? And of course, the vast majority of people in the West or in the foreign policy elites in the West are going to argue it's the Russians who caused it because they were imperialists. But you and I know better that this is largely a result of NATO expansion and that the West is principally responsible for this utter disaster.
Well, even in the unrealistic scenario that Ukraine would win, the best possible scenario, who would be left there to enjoy the victory, with this demographic, downward spiral? This is why it's very strange to me. And what makes it so much more sad as well is the fact that Zelensky, he kind of knew what would be the consequence of going down this path. You mentioned this, the negotiations in early 2022. Recall that back in March of 2022, he gave this interview to The Economist where he said, there are many countries in the West who don't want us to take a deal, who wants a long war. That is the word he used, long war with Russia, because we could weaken the Russians, even if it meant the destruction of Ukraine. So it's such a tragedy that we've gone down this path now for the past 4 years, and I think the war will end in Odessa, as you suggested before. If this will be the best victory for the Russians, I think, because if they can landlock Ukraine, not just would it be weakened and not be a future threat, a future frontline, but it would also lose its market value to NATO in terms of being an instrument of pushing Russia out of the Black Sea. And even the policies you see, the idea of de-Russifying Ukraine. I mean, this would entail de-Russifying Odessa, a historical Russian city, which would be just impossible for the Russians to accept and watch. So it just seems to me that this is where the war would end, by the Russians, essentially stepping into stepping into Odessa.
Yeah. Glenn, just one more point that came to mind when you were talking about Zelensky back in 2022. Before the war broke out, this is February 24th, 2022. That's when the war broke out. As you remember, in December, January, and first part of February, the Americans were saying that war is coming, war is coming. We were constantly saying that. And Zelensky was saying, stop saying that. You're going to make war happen. Zelensky was not interested in getting into a war with Russia. And then, of course, once the war breaks out, he is willing to go to Istanbul, or he's willing to send his negotiators to Istanbul. He's willing to work out a deal with the Russians. But then he makes a fatal mistake and he sides with um, basically the Americans and the British, walks away from the negotiations in Istanbul and commits himself to a long war that he thinks he's going to win. He buys the Western rhetoric that Ukraine's initial successes on the battlefield, and you remember they did reasonably well on the battlefield once the war started, that those initial successes coupled with economic sanctions and military backing from the West, would finish the Russians off. And then what happens over the course of 2022 is that, again, the Ukrainians do quite well on the battlefield. You remember they roll the Russians back in Kherson, they roll the Russians back in Kharkiv. And by the end of 2022, they think they're in great shape. And then you remember the June 2023 offensive that was supposed to, produce this giant blitzkrieg that would egregiously damage the Russian military. So once he buys on at the end of the Istanbul negotiations to the Western view of what's going to happen, once he reverses direction, he's in deep trouble because he doesn't realize it, but he's joining the losing side. You remember General Milley, again, very important. General Milley said in the fall, this is in the fall of 2022, after the Ukrainian successes in Kharkiv and Kherson, General Milley said, now's the time to cut a deal. This is the high water mark for Ukraine. And of course, Milley was correct, but nobody wanted to hear what Milley had to say. And that includes Zelensky, because Zelensky was thinking that he was on the winning side. He was on the march. Ukraine was going to win a great victory, and we would finish off the Russians, or at least wound them mortally in the summer of 2023. That was their thinking. And what happened is he just got sucked in to the vortex, and there's no getting out. And the end result is he's going to be seen by historians as having played a key role in destroying his own country.
Well, that was on that topic as well, contributing then furthermore fracturing the political West as well. So there is, I think the outcome of this will be profound. So as you suggested, I think future historians will look back at this as being one of our greatest mistakes in terms of weakening the position of the West.
And
But
it's not only political, Glenn, it's also economic. That Europe has not only suffered politically, it's suffered economically from this war.
yeah, well, thank you very much. We went a bit over time there, so I apologize. And thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights.
My pleasure as always, Glenn.